We are working now on real estate appraisals. And I think a really good opportunity for a exam question for the test would be just simply the definition of an appraisal, that it is an opinion of market value, not market price, not rebuild cost, but not assessed value, but it's an opinion of market value based on supportable evidence and approved methods to be researched by a licensed appraiser. Okay, so an opinion of market value. Now, for your career, I just want to put this in for you as well. How do appraisals really function in your day-to-day career as a real estate agent? And if you're representing a seller, you're not going to be hiring an appraiser to go out and figure out the value of your properties that you list. You're going to do what we call this CMA, this comparative market analysis. And you're going to pull data from past sales or current properties that are active on the market, that are competition, or maybe something that recently is sold but hasn't closed yet. You're going to do your own data. You're going to be able to pull that data, probably most likely through your local board of realtors, through a system that you'll subscribe to called the multiple listing service. That will house all sorts of great data for you to pull this. And there's other forms of MLSs, whether you're residential, commercial, ag, but you'll have a database of information that's collected to help you out with this. Okay. Past sales is the big indicator usually for comparative market analysis, is what have similar properties to this sold in the past. So when you're working with sellers and someone calls and says, Amy, come list our house. I'm not going to call an appraiser and say, can you get over to 123 Main Street? I need to know how much that is worth. No, I will do my data. With that, the seller will choose a list price. It's technically theirs to choose. It is their home. But hopefully they're doing it according to what your data presents, right? Then when a buyer gets an accepted offer, 90% of the time that buyer is going to use financing through a bank in order to buy that property. We're going to talk about financing in the next big section. But with real estate appraisals, what happens is once that offer gets accepted, the lender wants proof that the buyer has paid a fair value for that property. Because the last thing that a lender wants to do is lend $300,000 on a property that's really only worth $150,000. That would be a bad investment. They'd be upside down on that property that they bought. The moment that they closed, it's worth less than what they bought it for. A bank doesn't want that. So another phase of this appraisal to keep in mind is, in order to keep this fair so that the lender isn't calling his golf buddy all the time, yeah, get this appraised for me. It needs to appraise at 300, work your magic. The lender and the appraiser do not communicate. The lender puts in an order for an appraisal with what I'm going to call like a third-party service. An appraiser that's available to do the work is going to pick up that order and schedule an appointment with the listing agent to go and do their research on that property. The buyer pays for the appraisal, so they get a copy of it. The seller and the listing agent do not. In fact, the buyer's agent doesn't get it either, because none of those folks paid for it. A copy of it will go to the underwriter and a copy will go to the buyer. And the only time as a buyer's agent or as a listing agent you're probably going to truly see an appraisal report is if there's a problem. There's maybe a repair required by the appraiser, or the value came in lower than what the purchase price was. That's going to probably be about it. If the value came in above purchase price, that's just a green light, good to go. You're probably never even going to know about it. Okay. So there really is some distance, but with that being said, I do like to help appraisers because we're a real estate community, right? In order to get these properties closed, it's not just you, the real estate agent. You're going to have a lender and an appraiser involved, title companies, all these different folks, and we'll work through all those folks in this course. But the appraiser is a big key factor to it. And so I call and let them know anything I think that's helpful. And if I ever have an appraiser call and ask me a question, I try to do the best I can to answer it, because I figure you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or I scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. However that phrase goes. So appraisals are a big part of this process, but that's a little bit for your career, how it works. Here's one other thing I want to point out. If the appraisal comes in low, that's the number that the lender now has to use for all of their financing figures. So if the offer was 300 and the appraisal comes in at 290, 290 now is the number that the appraiser has to work off of. So what happens with that $10,000 difference? Well, the buyer brings the 10 grand in cash. Number two, the seller can drop the price to 290, or three, they can split that $10,000 between the buyer and seller of various increments, 50-50, 60-40, 40-60, 70-30, 30-70, whatever. Okay. Most times, if you're doing a really good job of knowing the market as a listing agent and as a buyer's agent, you shouldn't run into a lot of huge appraisal issues. Most times the appraisal comes in right at market level. And I know I've had buyers who thought they got a deal. They were disappointed that the appraisal didn't come in higher. I've also had deals where we kind of had an agreed purchase price of $113,399, kind of a weird purchase price, and the appraisal came in right at $113,399. How's that possible? Well, I'm not saying this to make the appraiser look lazy, because they're not. We're going to look at their report here in a few minutes, and it's definitely not anything that I want to be doing, because it's a lot of detailed work. I'd rather be in sales, but they do a lot of research. But when that does come in at the same value, they're not really there to make anyone look like a hero in terms of you getting great deals for your clients. They're basically saying, check, this can move on to the next process. We're good with what the purchase agreement is. Okay, you can move forward with this one. They've not overpaid for it. Okay. But appraisals will be a big part of your real estate career. So we've talked about the definition of an appraisal, comparative market analysis, and then a third type of evaluating the value is a BPO. This is like a less expensive version of an appraisal. A certified and licensed appraiser can do it, or a licensed real estate agent can do it. This is typically the quick version that banks use when they're doing a refinance on a loan, or someone is doing a line of credit against the equity in their home. So they owe $100,000, but it's worth $200,000. They're maybe getting an $80,000 line of equity there. That's another time. Or any time that maybe there's an asset manager that wants to review a lender's portfolio. A broker's price opinion could come into play. Great example, though, for the exam is going to be this value definition. And this is how we figure out the basis of a monetary value based on desirability for a potential buyer. And I want you to remember the acronym DUST. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Demand is how many people want to buy in that location, right? Des Moines probably has more demand on it than my teeny little tiny hometown of 600 people in Southeast Iowa, right? Utility says, is the property being used for its best purpose? We really call that highest and best use. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But are we putting houses on the right properties, or are we putting hog houses on something that's better as residential? It's highest and best use. Scarcity means there's only so much property available. And for those of you that are maybe in an area that's had a lot of new construction happen, remember when there were lots available in the suburbs, and now there's suburbs of the suburbs now that the lots are available, right? And there's nothing in the city anymore to build on for a house, right? That's because we've grown and grown. There's only so much land on earth, which is available, which leads to scarcity. Transferability. How easy is it to transfer the property from one owner to another? Or are there a lot of funky deed restrictions? I believe like that Walmart example I used in last video, where there's maybe some deed restrictions that Walmart created because they don't want competition moving into an old building. Is that kind of weird? Or things that are liens, which would be title defects that might be hard to solve or resolve. Okay, so dust is a great test item for you. Market value is the most likely price that should happen in an open market with fair conditions. So we're going to eliminate stressed or unique sales from that, meaning a foreclosure. You're reselling a house that someone lives in versus the foreclosure that is maybe a duressed sale down the street. Those would not be apples to apples comparison for an appraisal. Another example would be a parent selling their house to their child. That's not an open and fair market. Trust me, that child is not going to pay over list price for their parent's property to get it competitively, right? There's probably going to be some sort of deal that happens there. So it's got to be in an open and fair market, right? And it's based again on the data. Market price is the actual sales price that is seen by the buyer. So the market value is maybe 300, but the actual price that the buyer pays is 295. And that's very common what an appraiser sees for value and what maybe a buyer comes and notices for utility or something like that. There might be a great upgrade that's been done to the property, like maybe a bowling alley put into the property. That adds great value, but does every buyer really need or want a bowling alley in their home? Which means that could adjust the price based on kind of the desirability seen in the buyer's eyes. Okay, this example, of course, gave cost, which is rebuild cost. What you actually would insure your property for is very different than what the value is versus what it would cost to get lumber, especially right now with lumber prices so high. What would it cost to rebuild that property? The appraisal process, we've got a list here, and for exam purposes, I think you need to for sure just know the first one, which the first process in the appraisal process is to define the problem. Why is the appraiser doing that appraisal? What's the reason? And the example I normally give is, you know, when you see new developments happening with commercial, like maybe strip malls, used to be farmland and now there's businesses on it. And you look out and there's kind of that one house still standing. They're still holding on and not selling. Let's say that property finally sells, that 2-bedroom bungalow on 5 acres. When that property sells, the appraiser is going to have to evaluate What is the intention of this sale? Is the new buyer going to move into it as a 2-bedroom bungalow on 5 acres? Do I need to compare it to other bungalows on acreages? Or is it now going to be commercial and blend in with all the neighbors now that have cropped up new businesses? Is it being sold for development property? That can make a huge difference on the value of that piece of real estate. So I've got to define the problem. What's the intention of the purpose here? Another one I'm going to point out is the word reconcile. And reconciliation is, we'll get to this probably again in more material. Reconciliation is, of all the methods that they use to establish this value. We'll go over the 3 different methods that appraisers use here in a coming section. Of all the methods that they use, which one fits best? Which one makes more sense? It's not an average of all of them, but which one would have the most influence on the value? So we'll talk about that one again, but I do think knowing the word reconcile for the exam is important. Now, as we go into this uniform appraisal report, here's some things that they do to start collecting data. And then if you clicked on the link in the previous reading, you saw the actual 6-page standard form of an appraisal report. Now, most appraisal reports are going to be much larger than this. They're probably going to be 20 to 30 pages by the time the appraiser adds photos and maps of these past sales that they collect data on. It's actually going to end up being a lot larger. But I did want you to have your eyeballs on one, even though you may not see it a whole lot in your career, just so you understand all the detailed work that the appraiser does. You're on the sales end of it. The appraiser is the black and white accountant, is how I think of them, that's going to prove that what we sold it for was an actual accurate price, right, on behalf of the lender. I did want to highlight this right here in red, though, before we're done with this video. I know it's teeny, teeny, tiny little handwriting. Put on your bifocals, right? Or get out your binoculars. It says comparable sales in the subject neighborhood within the past 12 months, ranging in a sales price from $1 to $1. A great setup for the exam is going to be, which of the following would be the best comparable for a subject property to establish its value, its market value? A foreclosure, a sale between family members, an identical property in a neighboring neighborhood within the last 6 months, or a similar property within the exact same neighborhood within 12 months. Well, as we discussed earlier, we're going to eliminate the foreclosure and we're going to eliminate a sale between family members, unless we're trying to price a foreclosure, right? Any other sale, we're not going to compare it to something that's distressed or unique. So now we're down to, do we pick the town over within the last 6 months identical home, or a similar one, same neighborhood, 12 months? Well, based on this line that says subject neighborhood, 12 months, I think that that's one you got to pick. Not the one in the town over 6 months, but same neighborhood, last 12 months. I may not have mentioned this, and I'm sure that you've read it. Appraisals do have about 6 test questions on the exam. And I do think that that highlight could be helpful for you. I think the appraisal, knowing the definition, that it's for market value. The appraisal process of knowing that it starts with defining the problem. And knowing this DUST, demand, utility, scarcity, transferability, are all great options for you to know for the exam. So hopefully this was helpful. Next up on the list is principles of value.